Thank you, everyone, and welcome. My name's James Harding. I'm the editor here at Tortoise, and this is a double thank you and a double effort at open journalism. Double thank you because not only have you taken an interest and supported us in helping to build the Westminster Accounts, but for coming here this evening and engaging, we hope, in a ThinkIn. When we started Tortoise, we had this really simple idea that we would run a news meeting, but not just us journalists, open it up and make sure that everyone could join us, and we would get a better understanding of the stories we had, the leads we had, and where they might take us. And so our hope this evening is that we'll do what the Westminster Accounts tool does, start a conversation that might lead us to better understanding, more journalism, and heaven help us, possibly even some stories. So we hope that that's what we'll do this evening. But we started, as you saw that video, with a question. The truth is we didn't really start with a question. We started with a phone call. And what we thought we might do is just bring to life the whole process and project over 9 months of trying to make sense of the whole mismatch and muddle, the great big shoebox of Westminster declarations that we've tried to put in order. And so I'm going to start, I'll come to Kat Nealon, our political editor, and Sam Coates, who, as you've seen, has led all the coverage on Sky News on the Westminster Accounts. But I'm going to start, if I might, with you. John Riley and I have known each other a fair old time. We have found ourselves in some pretty awkward scrapes along the way. But one of the moments that I'll never forget now, John, is you calling and saying, I've got this idea. What was it?
So I'll give you a bit of context. I grew up in a house where politics was discussed, breakfast and in the evening, a lot. I also grew up in a house where I watched a huge amount of television. I wasn't a great reader. Watched a huge amount of television. So by the time I was a teenager in 74, 75, 76, and there was Britain was quite a divisive time. I was very interested in politics, but I couldn't hear or see politicians at work in the House of Commons, nor peers in the House of Lords. And I remember as a rather precocious, pompous teenager, this bothered me because so much was on the television, but I couldn't see the people who were wielding extraordinary influence. And then in 1978, audio was introduced to the House of Commons. I can still remember James Callaghan, who was then the Prime Minister, speaking at the dispatch box and listening to it on the radio. It seems archaic now. And when I entered journalism in 1984, the autumn of 1984, a long, long time ago, you still couldn't see MPs. You couldn't see them debating stuff in the House of Commons or giving statements. Again, seems medieval. So I've always felt very strongly that organisations, institutions, politicians, and our judiciary system needs to be more transparent. So I've always had, we need to show what's going on. It's why I got excited about the Westminster Accounts project. We need to delve in and try and peel back the layers of what is actually going on at the House of Commons with MPs, in the same way that Sky News championed the need for cameras in court. And we've been partially successful over the last 12 years, but not entirely successful yet. So I was very keen to try and, as I say, peel back how MPs get their cash. I also believe, as I know James does, that journalist organisations need to challenge the status quo. If we don't challenge the status quo, who is going to do that? Who's going to do that? And we live in a democracy. If journalism doesn't do that, who's going to do that? So I rang up James. It was April of last year. I said, I've got this idea. I think we should have a really hard look at how MPs are funded. And I also believe in partnerships, the power of partnerships. And as it said in the video, Sky News is a fast organisation. I hope not too fast. I hope we get stuff first and right. And Tortoise prides itself on being a slow organisation, hence, I guess, its name. But also, and it's a slight generalization, broadcasting can be rather supine, and it lets stories come to the broadcaster, and we react and we run around and we report it. And organizations like Tortoise go and delve and dig in and inquire. And now I've tried to sort of put that right at Sky News over the last 17 years or so, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. And I thought that was quite a good combination of an organization that is about reacting quickly and can have impact, and an organization that will delve and dig. And we have a very small but very smart data team, and Tortoise have a very small but smart data team. Put the two together, and we've come up with something rather magical. Yeah.
But you know what's interesting, John? I think that when you did call, I did. So one of the things that we've had this week is people pushing back and saying, I don't really see the point of this project. All of this stuff is declared, right? I mean, what's the point? All the stuff is already out there. But what I was thinking about was when you called, I immediately was, oh yeah, we need to do that. Because if you work in this area, if you've ever covered politics, you know that it's unbelievably difficult to understand what's going on. There's a massive gap between transparency and visibility, right? People are declaring it, you just can't see what's happening. And so the thing that was interesting to me was immediately saying, oh yes, if we did that, we will learn a lot about our politics. And I wondered whether Kat and Sam, you came into this, and of course in a kind of classic editor's way, we thought, right, we'll commission it, then we'll sit back and, you guys can get in the front line of it. I wonder what it's like being in the front line of it, whether MPs have said, as I just said, there's nothing to see here, or whether they've been angry and unhappy.
Yes,
Kat, why don't you go first?
Sam and I were just sharing notes on this. There have been quite a few unhappy calls and messages and things.
And in the sort of spirit of sharing our workings, but what's the unhappiness? What do you think that they're saying legitimately we're getting wrong?
I think that they, again, some of it is, oh, well, this is already known. Why are you doing this in the first place? It sort of ranges from, oh, there's nothing to see here, to you're actually trying to destroy my life. And then you kind of have to sort of try and pass where the sort of actual genuine substance of their complaints is. And sometimes it's just someone wants to let off a bit of steam because you've suddenly kicked up some dust and they're getting a lot more attention. Sometimes there have been a couple of minor mistakes because there are thousands and thousands of data set. That's just kind of not unexpected, I think. We knew that there might be some things that fell through the cracks, and there are, some mistakes that MPs have entered into their own registers. And I think that the response has been from fellow journalists kind of the opposite, and campaigners. We have had just so many emails and texts and, kind of...
I should say it's an amazing thing, because usually in our business, the other journalists are first to pile in.
Yeah.
So that's kind of been an amazing... But Sam and I were at the Times together when MP's expenses broke at the Telegraph. Those painful nights. Sam, what's the sort of shadow of MP's expenses on money in politics and the way in which MPs have interacted with you? And what's the difference, do you think, between this and that?
MP's expenses was one of the most miserable periods of my life, possibly your life as well, largely for the reason that we were at the Times and it was a story
in the Telegraph.
By the Telegraph. And we're not going to retell the story of how we got to that point right now, but what you had then is so burnt on MP's consciousness that it is relevant to the experience of this week. Because what happened then is night after night, the Telegraph would pick 3 or 4 MPs and basically pour an enormous bucket of manure all over them with incredible headlines. And everybody would chase. I mean, by the end, we were just copying it out bluntly because you didn't have access to the source material. There was no way of checking. Everybody wanted to read this stuff. It was salacious. It was gruesome. It was gripping. It was everywhere. And it scarred a generation of politicians. And it scarred less in a lesser way a generation of political journalists as well, particularly those who weren't doing it. Because there's a very, very, very big but, which is as time went on and as the dust settled, and in some cases this is a story that only was told months, if not years later, not every bit of what was done in a splashy, great big kind of, with the spotlight on it turned out to be completely right. Some of the greatest moments of expenses actually turned out not to be true. I think it was the duck house that was never actually claimed for. There was a sense of unfairness in MPs because some of the clickbaity stories about claiming for a few pence for mileage got bigger play than, for instance, David Cameron's interest rate-based housing arrangements that allowed him, with one document, to claim all the money he was that he was entitled to. And the point about that, the reason that's interesting and relevant today, is that we all have different collective memories of the expenses scandal, but the collective kind of, it's such as there are still the same MPs in Parliament there today. One of the feelings of MPs that's lingering, and they won't really say it publicly, but it's below the surface, is one of deep unfairness, that some people were picked out and other people weren't. And that began a process where over the last decade or so, the subject of MPs and money is seen really crudely as an issue of attack against MPs. And we're in a slightly wider, slightly more hostile political environment than we were. 2 MPs have been murdered, and a fact that is kind of we're reminded of even this week. And I am sensitive to that. And that's why when I had my first meeting with you, the most important thing that I was keen to stress, and I think you were receptive, is like, the point of what we're going to do is not gotcha. It's public service. We've got the time and the space. And frankly, we don't have the material that the Telegraph did to even try and do that. We want to do something that genuinely takes us wherever it goes, not with an artificial deadline and a desire for single lines that dominate for brief periods of time like fireworks. And that was the mission.
And so I'm just interested. By the way, if you've not been to a ThinkIn before, the whole idea is that everyone pipes up. So please don't be coy. Just catch my eye, and I'll come to you. And by the way, if you think the people who did all the work, like David and Matthew and Tom and Nick and Sean and all these people from Sky who join us, and Katie and Joe who are here from Tortoise, who've done all the work, who've put this thing together. If you think you're getting off scot-free, you can forget about that too. So we'd love to hear from you. But really, we want to have a conversation, because I think we should be open and honest with ourselves about trying to understand what that data does tell us, what it doesn't tell us, where we think we should investigate on the back of it. And we'd love to hear from everyone here, or as many people as possible. So please don't wait till the end, because it'll be too late by then. I guess I would like to, though, ask you what you think we've really learned, because there are people who would say, I stand back from all of this, and what I think I look at is a politics, or say what I think we'll stand back and look at a politics that's not corrupt. It doesn't feel to me as though we should be, screaming in the way other nations might, but certainly a world in which politics and politicians are biddable, that influence, access, advocacy are available and you can pay for it. And that's a risky proposition in a politics. That's the way I read it, but you might not. I'm interested to know. Kat, why don't you go first?
Yeah, I think it's probably a bit more subtle than that. And I think that's probably
Story of my life. Commissioning stories that are not quite what I hoped. Yeah.
I think that's probably why, there is no sort of big smoking gun of no bags of cash like there have been in Brussels so far. Because we do have quite a lot of safeguards in our system. But what we have found there are some loopholes in the rules that we have, which are allowing influence to happen and are allowing question marks to form over when did that MP form that opinion? Was it before they took the £7,000 flight to Qatar and enjoyed all the 6-star luxury things that Qatar have to offer, or after they came back? And the MP can say, well, I've always thought Qatar is the best thing since sliced bread. We don't know. And that's, is that okay with the MP? Is that okay with the people who vote for that MP? These are the kind of questions that we need to ask. There are rules around people accepting donations from individuals. For example, you have to be, registered on the Electoral Commission. It has to be a UK registered company for donations and so on. But Qatar can be the fourth largest donor because of the money it's spent on hospitality rather than actual cash. I think that's a big question mark for me.
Sam, what did you come away thinking?
So if you watch the coverage on Sky over the last 4 days, we came away focusing on the thing that this tool does, which is genuinely revolutionary, by turning everything into a spreadsheet, which is the incredible work of Joe and Katie and the whole team, and it really is quite something, is it allows you to do something that MPs hate more than anything else on earth, which is to create leaderboards. It basically sorts things in terms of size, and the size is the size of money. So what we've never been able to do is work out who the biggest donors to MPs are, the biggest earners, the biggest recipients, and then the biggest, as it were, the biggest secretariat funders of APPGs. That's a slightly different thing. But suddenly we had league tables and we had time to delve into stuff. And forgive me, I'm not going to go re-rehearse all the arguments that you hopefully have seen a little bit of on Sky News and in Tortoise this week. And I'm going to instead just give you two overall reflections. The first is, MPs say that we have transparency. What we actually have is a set of rules to try and enforce transparency. And it goes to your point about transparency rules versus visibility. What I've come away from this project thinking, and I didn't know this before, was that if you follow the rules, that doesn't necessarily allow us, the public, or us, the media, to know what's going on. Yeah. That was the case with the company giving to the Labour front benches. That's the case really with the slightly rickety broadband company giving to 24 Conservative MPs between £2,000 and £9,000 from an office block that is completely shut up in a Blackburn industrial estate. Just following the rules doesn't give you the transparency. So that's my first big lesson. And my second big lesson, and we told this story in lots of different ways, is that the oil in the conversation, the wheels are oiled in the conversation when MPs engage. Really, for me, if you come across something and then you ask an MP and they go, well, yeah, that's that like that because I did this, this, and this, and it's completely understandable, then you'll find that often it's not that exciting. It goes to your point about it not being corrupt. And sometimes the media go away because it's actually a perfectly normal. One of the most striking things was just how MPs didn't want to engage. The moment you say money, they didn't. I cannot tell you how many times we phoned, WhatsApp, called Theresa May. I cannot tell you how many times we tried to get in touch with, in the end, with David Lammy, with the MPs at the heart of the IX wireless stuff, with Yvette Cooper, who issued a statement that says it would, that literally, here is a statement about your questions and it is not to be quoted. I mean, what else are you going to do apart from say that on the telly? And it's MPs run away from the subject. So it is, we don't have the transparency we're told we do, and MPs are reluctant to engage to the detriment of anything. And there are some MPs that have come away from our coverage, I suspect, quite sore because we made a big point of really saying, we tried to get hold of you. You wouldn't explain what's going on. Some of them had to come out and clarify afterwards. They're two really big lessons.
John? So let's not do it slightly different. Is just that the system could be better. Yeah. The system could be clearer. And Paul Bew, who was the chair of the All-Party Public Standards Committee back in July 2018, wrote to the then Prime Minister Theresa May and said, the system needs to be better, more transparent for the voter. That's 4.5 years ago, and nothing's happened. Now, is that because they're complacent about the way it is, or they're very happy with the lack of clarity? So, I run a big organisation. Rigor and process is good. It needs to be clear to everybody.
But it was interesting, John, when Sophie Ridge was interviewing Keir Starmer on Sunday morning and the whole thing, they'd run your tape, Sam, and then Keir Starmer comes on. And to be fair to him, this whole thing had just landed in his lap, right? I thought that he would say, well, look, obviously there's a lot to look at here, and I'd like to take a look at it before I jump to a conclusion. Actually, he jumped to a conclusion and said, well, we've got a great deal of transparency and we declare. And that really wound me up. For the first time in the whole exercise, I was wound up because I thought, actually, we have identified two problems in the system of transparency, kind of organizational muddle, right? And I think a kind of tick box transparency where, if you are Theresa May, you can say that the Speaker Bureau has given you a certain amount of money, but we don't know who you're speaking to. We don't know what the relationship is that's being forged. It feels as though there's a personal level to it and a systemic level. Sorry,
I'd add a third point to that, which is that a lot of it is predicated on Companies House being A, searchable, B, that these are genuine companies, which I don't know if Graham Barrow's here, but he is, if you haven't followed him on Twitter, please do, because he's incredible at finding 20 Chinese-sounding companies that have suddenly registered at a random semi-detached house in the middle of Hertfordshire, and it's just fraud. But that would be sufficient for an MP to say, yeah, that's a UK-listed company. Well, how is that okay?
There's a slightly awkward thing going on, which is, Connor, would you do the lights up? Because I've got a slightly I am Spartacus moment here. I don't know whether people putting their hands up are Graham Barrow or they're just putting their hands up. No, okay, yes. Okay, Wayne, would you just say who you are? Some people know some people and some people don't. Thank you.
Hi, am I on?
You're on.
Hi everyone, I'm Carla Denyer, co-leader of the Green Party. First of all, I wanted to say thank you for this project. I think it's really fantastic. And I do hope that it does result in a change to how Parliament itself records this data, as John suggested. I maybe I'm naive, but I believe it probably will eventually. I wanted to come in partly to slightly disagree with you that there's no big smoking gun. So I'm sure quite a lot of us have delved into the data. The Greens looked at it, and one of the things we noticed is that 40% of the top 20 donors to the Conservative Party are the property development industry, basically, either companies directly or people very strongly linked to them. And I think that the connection between that and the policies that are going through that really fatally weaken councils' abilities to push back on planning applications, even when they trample over the policies of local councils, is, I'm sure, not a coincidence. And I say that as a local councillor, amongst other things. And then I wanted to ask the panel and or the rest of the room, did you enter into this project partly with the hope of policies changing around donations and earnings, as well as reporting? Because I think that our ambitions shouldn't just stop at there should be more transparency, but that we should also be pushing for better regulated political donations in general.
I entered the project sort of with an open mind. Is what is it going to tell us? It might have thrown up no stories at all, but it did.
I think it's actually quite interesting, that, isn't it? Because we didn't. Lots of people have very, very different views about funding of political parties. We didn't. In that sense, it was very simply a journalistic exercise. The interesting thing about it is what happens to it over time. Nick Sutton, who runs all the digital stuff for Sky, we were talking about, I don't know, Nick, what the latest numbers are on the number of people who've used the tool. Do you have any sense of it?
Well, it was over 500,000 this morning.
Right. So I think the interesting question. Can everyone hear Nick? It was about 500,000 people. I think there's an interesting question there, Carla, which is what happens when actually people get used to thinking, oh, we now have access to donations, earnings, benefits in a way that's accessible and intelligible. I think that debate happens. I don't know what you think, John. In some ways, that we can have opinions on that. It's for you politicians to go away and say, right, here's what we think we should do with the system.
Yeah.
So there's a gentleman here and there's someone here. Yeah, would you?
Tom Ray.
Hello, Tom.
democracy, and prior to that, an MP for over 20 years who came out unscathed from the expenses scandal. I wanted to know what commitment is there from you to maintain this longer term, or whether in fact you've had any conversations prior or since with the parliamentary authorities, because I think many people think that actually this is something that they should be doing. And one completely different question, did you consider running something similar around ministers and their reporting? Because in terms of getting clarity about who they are being lobbied by, them, permanent secretaries and special advisors, I think that is just as, if not more, opaque and probably more significant in terms of the influence they exert.
John, will you do the long-term question? Sam, do you want to do the SPADs?
We're committed to running the project until the end of this Parliament, which could go on until January 2025. And I'm very, very keen that I hope someone else joins forces with us so we can carry it on beyond that. As some of you may know and some of you may not know, the Register of MPs' Financial Interests is updated every 2 weeks. So this is an organic project. It's not set in stone, and it will change, and new stories may well emerge from it as the next 2 years roll on.
Can I just ask a question? So Joe White's here. Joe White and Katie Riley were the people who, just to give you a sense of this thing, which is, and we don't want to get too kind of wordy about it, it's been unbelievably fascinating, exciting, frustrating, anxious making. Yeah. And part of it is when we sat with Katie and Joe to begin with, and I remember the very first thing, Joe, you showed was on a gambling all-party parliamentary group, and we started making the links together. But just to give a sense of what it's like internally, we spent this whole week going, when's the next update? Because we expect the Boris Johnson speeches payments to drop, right? This is the Parliamentary Register of Interests. You would have thought that you would know when that happens. We can't find out when it happens, and we've asked.
Yes, it's more exciting for us than Harry.
Yeah.
It dropped about 5 minutes ago. In the course of this thinking, so please watch this space. When this is over, we'll get on it.
It is a measure of how hard Joe White has worked. That the same Fair Isle jumper he was wearing in the video we did 2 months ago, he's not allowed out the building. So Sam, you just respond to Tom.
So Tom raised a really interesting question. Is Parliament going to do it themselves? They say yes. They say we could have a version of it. There's going to be a searchable version of the Register of Members' Interests, maybe as soon as March, probably more realistically by June. But listen to it carefully. Listen carefully to what they're promising, because there's an enormous but coming. Yes, it will be searchable, but they're not attempting, as far as I can possibly find out, to do the thing that has been so controversial. The thing that has tied Joe and Katie up in knots, brought everybody to their knees and to close to sort of tears at points, is taking the register and trying to work out not what their various financial interests are, but coming up with a figure for what people are earning, a figure for what they're donating, a figure for what they're receiving. Putting a single figure next to an MP's name, now that's hard work, 'cause it's not the format that they provide it in, and it's controversial. And I don't think the Parliament website are going to do that, because if Parliament attempt to do anything that upsets MPs, the MPs will stop it happening. So I think there's going to be something that's a little bit more friendly coming down the track than the Control-C, Control-F version that we have at the moment on a PDF. But don't expect it to do half the things that ours can. Because ours, slightly, the way we've done it slightly rubs people up the wrong way, but it's the right thing to do. And MPs are never going to authorise that.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, thank you, James. Ian Anderson. I'm both chair of a business called Cicero, which is a lobbying company, and I've also just become the chair of Stonewall, so I can see this from lots of perspectives. Keep going. Keep going. It's the reason I called my business Cicero. to your point.
What do you think, to the point about influence?
So let me just come back to that in a second, James. I think there's two parts to this. When this subject is tackled by news media, usually it's a pop-up story. It's a sting. It's usually on Sunday morning, and then people like me might pop up and say there are no lobbyists to be seen, or there are some lobbyists to be seen, or there's some money to be seen. So the fact that this project is going to continue through and until the election is spot on. I think your question about Stormont, really interesting, James, because usually we see leaders of the opposition calling for maximum reform. And then when they get into power, Sir Humphrey saying, oh, it's all terribly difficult, Minister, isn't it? Yeah. So keep asking that question. So absolutely spot on. Little vignette. I was once asked to whether or not we'd take on a mandate for a Chinese company that wanted to give every single member of Parliament a car. We said no. But I mean, the reason I make that point is that's essentially about the due diligence both that the lobbying sector should do on the work that it does. And I think, as most of you know, I'm a great believer in that. And the due diligence that members of Parliament do or don't about the meetings that they're having and what's going to take place. On the point about influence, Cameron set up a flawed lobbying register in the middle part of the last decade. It means that it captures people like me, but what it doesn't capture is 90% of the activity that's taking place. So for me, and it's the reason I'm very happy to support this work, it's the reason I'm here tonight, I think I would like, and I'd love to have this conversation with all of you, how we take this work and move it into a fundamental reform to create wider transparency so that the word influence can't be used. It's a public policy process, so let's shine a light on it.
I do think, I think, Tom, your point, which is, how do you widen it? To be honest with you, there have been lots of moments in this project where we've said, we can't do that yet. We're just, the risk and the worry was getting things wrong. Sam and I were muttering to each other before we got started. Do we think we've got away with it? That's the worry that you have when you start a project like this. You get things wrong, and then the whole thing is broken. Yeah, it's a massive undertaking.
The likes of Joe, big brain, needs to be rewarded for that.
and we're passing the hat round.
Yeah,
absolutely. Can I just do one thing though, which is just, John and I were lucky enough that we were invited for lunch today at a lunch that Tina Brown organised for the launch of the Sir Harry Evans Fellowship, this first young journalist, amazing journalist, gone to Durham, come from Texas, and we were talking about investigative journalism, and there was a big discussion about it. And David Walmsley, who's here as the editor of the Globe and Mail, talked about an exercise that they'd done at the Globe and Mail, which was looking at the data on convictions and sentencing within the Canadian justice system. And the thing that David said, there's a lot that was inspiring about this lunch, Dean, I should say. Always when you talk about Harry Evans, it's inspiring. There was a lot about it. But actually, we had this interesting conversation about, or David led it, about how do you invite people to say that you're wrong? How do you invite people to check whether or not what you're doing is right? And in this exercise, every day, the two people who've really coordinated things for us, David Mapstone, who's run the whole Sky team, and Emma Sullivan, who's run the Tortoise team, we get together every day at 12:30. When I say we, they get together at 12:30 and talk about what we've got wrong, complaints and corrections. And I just thought it'd be useful to hear from David and Emma for a moment on what do you think we're learning about where we could do things better? What's the way that, to John's point, we do make this an iterative process and we learn more along the way? Emma's behind you, yeah.
I suppose that I start with a general point, which is that what the Westminster Accounts tries to do is paint the portrait of a system, and it's quite natural that we would focus quite a lot on MPs, but of course MPs is just part of it. I think both of our organisations have been intrigued by all-party parliamentary groups. And also accessible within the tool is donations from the Electoral Commission to political parties. And the reason I mention that is because a lot of what we've been talking about is about the kind of eclectic informality of the British system.
Yeah.
And what the Westminster Accounts attempts to do is take a snapshot of all of the casual interconnections and money flows that go in and out of the political system. And I think it's I totally understand why Sam and Kat are getting feedback from MPs who feel kind of there's something invasive about what we've done, but we make it very explicit within in what we've written in the site as you travel through it, that MPs are just one part of the overall network, and as a matter of fact, are a small part of it. And so the reason I began with that is just to say that so this week, the meetings we've been having about sort of whether we need to make tweaks or adjustments to language, whether statistics are right or wrong. What's been very impressive to me, and is obviously a big tribute to Katie and Joe, is that almost nothing, in fact, I think literally nothing in terms of numbers has been changed. And that's a massive achievement when you consider hundreds of thousands of data points.
At this stage, David, I sort of feel the hot breath of my old colleague Keith Blackmore that says, "Never do anything to irritate the news gods." And they can be vicious in response.
It may well happen, but in a sense, but the volume of criticism, I think, if it's possible, it's all about sort of apparent or alleged misinterpretation. Almost all of which is unjustifiable if you actually look at what we've sort of really gone out of our way to write, sometimes multiple times in the tool. But
just very, very quickly, the argument 10 days ago I didn't expect to be having with MPs about the tool was not about what we'd written, but was about people who didn't read what we'd written. And I'm having this at-volume conversation with people who've told me that we're on a witch hunt, they've cancelled their Sky subscription and they'll never speak to me again, about what do we do about the people who aren't engaging with what we've done. And it's a really surreal and difficult conversation to do. So if anyone has any ideas how you change a tool that people don't look at, let me know.
I think you and Prince Harry have the same problem there. People having comments about things they haven't read. Emma, did you want to just mention anything in terms of
I guess the one specific that we're grappling with daily at the moment, and to John's point that it's an evolving tool, is around donations that MPs, money that MPs might receive that they then donate. So currently we haven't presented that number where applicable, that an MP may well have put that on their register. And that's totally kind of in the works, that I think it's had a lot of kind of brain power on this week. But the as you can appreciate, the representations that are made to Kat or to Sam and James too by some of the MPs, like I simply am passing this money on, I am making that donation. I think one of the interesting points this week was replying to one of those MPs and just say, we simply can't see that in the register. That is what you are claiming, but you haven't actually put that in the register. So there is a, I guess, to Kat's point, like we've kicked up some dust and people have been frustrated and said, well, you aren't accurately reporting, but they aren't accurately or inputting that information into the register. So that's been, I guess, the hot issue of the last 24 hours at least.
Emma, thanks. I just want to bring my colleague Matt Dancona, and then I'll come to you, man, in the white.
Thanks, James. I'm ancient enough to remember the original Nolan report in 1995. One of the 7 principles he came up with, Lord Nolan, was openness. And I remember at the time asking a Conservative cabinet minister, this openness stuff is going to cause you some trouble. He said, no. He said, when you've got a secret or a series of secrets, you don't put them all in one safe because someone might crack the safe. You disaggregate them, put them in lots of places in plain sight. No one will ever join them up. And I thought that's a bit cynical. Cut to 28 years later, it's exactly what has happened. And it reminds me of that wonderful line in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy where Arthur Dent is complaining that he wasn't able to find the planning plans to knock down his house, and the demolition team say, but the plans were on display, Mr. Dent, and he says yes, they were in the basement in a disused lavatory in a filing cabinet with a sign saying beware of the leopard. And I think what's brilliant is that this tool gets you into that filing cabinet, and I think this is more than I think the context of all this is incredibly important, and one shouldn't lose sight of it. It's not a witch hunt, but it takes place in an incredibly febrile and incredibly important moment for politics, which is that since Nolan, there's been a whole series of ethical crises, of which, as you mentioned, parliamentary expenses was the most obvious, but by no means the only one. And let us not forget that the reason we have Rishi Sunak in number 10 and had Liz Truss before is because there was a sort of ethical crash to match the financial crash in 2021-22, and that trust in politics is at a dangerously low ebb now. And this is serious stuff. Now, to return to the tool, it's not the job of a journalist to create institutions or to even dream up policy, except in editorial columns. But the job of reporters is to report. And the brilliance of this is that it has found the safe. It has found the filing cabinet. And I think that's really important, because what we can get out of this is, to what Sam was saying, the league table. Politicians hate league tables in the same way that schools, when the examination results, hated league tables. And I think it's no small achievement, actually. It's exactly what journalists should be doing. It's much more important than bloviation, and it will really, if it continues as I hope it will, it could change the terms of trade quite considerably.
Matt, thank you. Have you got Joe? Who's got a mic? Thanks, Lizzie. It's on there. Thank you.
Yeah, my name's Jessie Jacobs, and I'm the director of the Democracy Network. And in a previous world, I went up against Ben Houchin, who was the mayor in Tees Valley. And former to that, I used to run a number of charities working with those who were really on the margins. And firstly, I just want to say how heartened I was to see the launch of this, because we represent 900 organisations, from the very small projects in County Durham that are trying to give people a voice to shape how local decisions are made, all the way to electoral reform. But there's something about power and the way that this is exposing the influence of power comes right back down to the community projects that I used to work with, because not long ago I went into a food bank and there was someone who was basically trying to feed their child with 4 chicken nuggets and some baked beans, and that was the food that they were going to have in the day. She had a payday loan. She was spending extortionate amounts on gas and energy, and she, her bills did not stack up. When you think about who was funding these MPs and who was funding these politicians and these powerful people, and you look at loans companies and you look at finance and you look at the gas and energy companies, and then you look at that one young woman in that food bank who was like, this is how I have to live. And she did not believe that she had any agency or any power to hold anyone to account or change anything that happened to her. This is my life. I don't vote. I don't engage. And if it gets worse, that's just how it is. And it's probably going to get worse. And what we're all doing today in working with democracy organisations in making sure that we've got a media that holds the powerful to account is sort of, we're working on behalf of that woman to make sure that actually there is an ability to hold power to account. And so that's why I was really, really heartened on behalf of the 900 organisations, because I left my campaign after work. Like, we found out lots of things that were happening in the Tees Valley around the people who were funding the mayor, and then the people who were getting contracts for the things that the mayor was connected to, such as the airport, such as the Tees Works, significant things that there was a direct link, but because of these standalone companies, there was no ability to hold the standalone companies to account with FOIs and other things. And we always felt like we would be able to expose more if there was time to do it. It needed long-term investigative journalism to start to dig deep. So, and the beauty of this this connection between both Tortoise and Sky News is it's been able to do both. So I just want to celebrate it.
Thank you very much. There's someone just behind you who had your hand up. Yes.
Hello, Paul Farnell. Work for a non-profit called Any One Thing. My main question, I mean, first of all, as others have said, applaud the tool and the data that's out there as a result. But it was a data question really from me. So one of you at the beginning described it as like a spreadsheet version of the Register of Interests. And I guess I would say it's not. It's kind of a PowerPoint presentation of that data. And I would love to see the spreadsheet version or to have access to that. And I suppose, is there a plan potentially down the line to kind of open up the underlying data?
So Paul, you're now going to see how this whole project works. As soon as a real question comes along, we hand over to Katie Riley. Katie, do you want to do that? Yeah.
Yeah, so there is, the version that you're looking at is powered by a database that mostly Joe built with a bit of my help. And we are currently in discussion about making that kind of underlying data available. The problem currently is that all of the registers are very complicated. So the data is very raw and it's very complicated. And we've taken a lot of time and care to learn about how the registers work. And so we are somewhat reticent to just throw it out into the world without the proper context, because we don't want, people who don't actually understand what they're looking at to use our data to accuse someone of something that they haven't done. But it's definitely in the spirit of the project to make it available publicly. So that will happen probably at some point.
The other thing to add is that Tortoise and Sky News are going to set up a fund to help people navigate their way through our systems, or individuals, or local journalists or bloggers or whatever. We haven't sort of announced that in a trumpet yet, but we will do.
We just did, John.
Yeah. Quietly.
The thing, because I should just say one thing about it, Paul. We do want to do that. The one thing about it that felt incredibly cool for us, me and John, who sort of sit back and go, okay, where does this go? Is when you suddenly see someone, we saw Fergal Sharkey going through the tool saying, oh, look at the relationship between water companies and the water APPG, and you're like, okay, this is brilliant. Things can happen. And what we'd love to do is see a way in which, if you're a student or a citizen or a blogger or a local journalist, you say, I don't have a political axe to grind. I'm not trying to score a partisan or personal point, but I would like to investigate X. We think it's a story. In fact, Tina, it's quite a lot in the spirit of the fellowship, which is how do you unleash another generation of investigative journalism and use this as a tool. So that's the hope with that. You wants to make a point.
Yes, Jelena Sofronievich, also a journalist. And I think this has been one of the most constructive and iterative, but also engaging pieces of journalism over the last few years for me. And a big part of that has been because everything you've been saying this evening, but also about understanding how, in one of the sense makers this week, you talked about this being a window that needs constantly cleaning. And I think what the Westminster Accounts have shown is that this is a window that's perhaps dirty by design, whether it's been everything you were saying earlier, Sam, about this sort of tick box transparency, or the fact that the data comes in all these different kinds of documents and forms that you then need to distill. And for me, it was APPGs, learning about how they're structured just completely blew my mind. And this is someone who studied politics from like an institutional perspective at school and at uni. And that's kind of what I wanted to ask, whether from your reporting, it's changed your perspectives of how transparency in Parliament really works, and also whether these MPs are accepting money on the basis of it being personal financial gain, or whether there are also political, whether that's party political or parliamentary political gains to be had in accepting money in this way or in these ways.
So for me, what the data does from my perspective, is to provide a starting point for further inquiry. And we've got a huge amount of data. We've sort of only scratched the surface of it. And I think, and I hope, John notwithstanding, that we're going to keep going with that. We got the stories to air that we managed to get by the time the deadline came along. But there are a lot of things that I just don't quite understand, want to ask a few more questions on, and we have the luxury of not quite as firm a deadline now. We hope to do the next round. I think I do think that we're scratching the surface of APPGs. I think if you watch yesterday's film, what we had was some of the most senior lobbyists in the lobbying industry basically saying on camera there are problem APPGs. They offer cash for access. I mean, maybe one of them had had a glass of wine and was speaking a little bit too freely. If I could let you into, one of them said to me, "I've got a rule, Sam. I never do media after a glass or two of wine, but I'm going to make an exception for you." I'm not sure that individual, who was the first lobbyist that we spoke to and interviewed in that film, will feel that her initial rule was wrong. But if there are senior figures in the lobbying industry saying there are bad apples, I think that's a pretty good. But also you just want more data. You want more things. You want this to expand. Sorry, and you want and it's not only the data in there. It's also that John has given me and the enormous team, Tom Larkin and Tom Rayner and colleagues at Sky, the time to look at this, because this was out there, but you don't look at stuff that's just out there very often because, the big red breaking news strap is at the bottom of the screen and you're running into the studio. The time was as important, almost as important as the data, and that's what we had, both of those together, that matters.
Yeah, points. So.
Matt Payton, and I'm a Tortoise subscriber.
Love you.
Thank you. So I went through fantastic data. And found that my local MP had been taking some donations from a controversial developer in our town, forwarded that onto the local paper, and they were really lovely and honest and said, "We just don't have time to look into this. What's my next step? How do I use that data?" As a citizen who doesn't really have an axe to grind, just goes, "That's a bit fishy, that's a bit strange. Where do I take it and what can I do next?"
So it's a brilliant question, and I'm going to do the things you'd expect a journalist to do in this circumstance: A, busk it, and then B, pass it on to someone else. So the thing that we're trying to deal with here, which is how do we deal with this responsibly? Because we don't know each other, other than your qualities as a member of Tortoise. We don't know each other. So how do I know that when you are investigating your MP, it's not actually, you're not also running? Right, so we have to make sure that we establish that. We then, I think, have to be realistic that a lot of stories fall over. Right, so some of the ones that we had early in the project, in fact, even as little as kind of a week, 10 days ago, fell over. Right, but what we'd like to do in terms of setting up this fund is make allocations available that people can spend some money to investigate it properly, right? And that we then, between us in different forms, fact check it properly before it's being put out, because we have to accept that it's often, not necessarily going to come to exactly what people suspect it might be. John,
have you written to the MP?
That would be a great next step.
You just write to him with the evidence, and he will have to reply and try and generate a dialogue, and then go to the local paper and see what they say. Where is it? Where do you live?
Burnley in Lancashire.
Right. Yeah. I mean,
if it's good, send it to me.
Juicy, not quite that juicy. That's from Blackburn, but so hopefully you enjoy that.
and just don't take no for an answer. Persevere.
Yeah.
And maybe think about timing if you really want to get it in the paper before elections. They might find suddenly they've got more time to follow your story.
I have a very profound question. When you talked about Fergal Sharkey going through the tool, did you mean Fergal Keane or did you mean Fergal Sharkey?
No, Fergal Sharkey.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. The Rivers campaigner. Yes, I did.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Just checking.
I actually don't have a question, but I want to break some news in the middle of the news has happened while we've been in here that's very relevant to sort of spark some discussion. The person at the top of our most donated to MPs leaderboard was Keir Starmer. That was with £740,000. Boris Johnson has just declared a single donation that's taken him to the top of that with £1 million. So one donation from Christopher Harborne, who had previously donated £13.7 million to Reform, is a crypto lobbyist. So in one single donation, Boris Johnson is now at the top of our most donated to.
No, hold on. He spoke. He spoke, or he received a donation.
He received a £1 million, a donation to the value of £1 million to his private office.
For what's it? Oh, for office space. So he's taken £1 million in donation in a donation.
In kind or?
And is that all? By the way, is that all that's been reported?
There's another speech, another 250 grand speech.
That was the Singapore speech.
For a speech.
So he's leapt to the top of our leaderboard.
Can I just ask? I want to. So there's a gentleman there who I said to speak. So I realise that we're running out of time. So.
Tom Schuller, no skin in this game. I'm just a punter. I want to strike a slightly contrary note, if I may. I mean, congratulations on doing this. But let me raise an issue, which is where I'm concerned about quality of MPs, who's deterred from coming in. And this audience is supremely intelligent, but not representative of the population as a whole, who will just think, all MPs in it for what they can get. Is there any way in which your information is gradable from corrupt to non-corrupt, or some similar system? Because some of the payments must be legit, used for good purposes. Some, probably like the one we've just heard, are not. And it seems to me quite important to make a distinction between those. So I haven't looked in detail at the tool. Is there any way you can make judgments grading them on integrity to corruption?
I'm not Sam to come back there, but there's just a gentleman on the side of you, David. You just pass it.
Yeah, just briefly. So I work for an NGO called Spotlight on Corruption. One thing that we're calling for, following reports from the Electoral Commission and the CSPL, which have called for the same thing, is for the parties themselves to do these checks on the donations, which they don't really do at the moment at all, to do sort of due diligence checks, either from sort of a literal making sure that they're not criminal funds to they're not going to reputationally damage. Yeah, exactly. So just to add that.
Kat, Sam, do you want to answer the point? Isn't it the case that actually what the Westminster Account shows is the exact opposite of they're all in it? It shows that actually there are very small numbers of people who are earning very large sums.
Yes. And also I think on Sky earlier this week, Caroline Noakes made quite a sort of valid point about the fact that large amount that was linked to her account, I think it was through one of her APPGs perhaps, was from a refugee group. I think when it comes to that sort of thing, you probably do have to apply your own judgment there. Do you think that receiving money from a refugee charity or whatever it is the same as receiving money from a healthcare firm or a betting firm or whatever? I kind of leave that up to you to make that decision.
I come back to the point. The data is the starting point, not the end point, and we don't make judgments. The closest that we come to is to try and place somebody within the sort of financial universe. So you'll know if they're a top earner, you'll know if they're a top recipient of donations or a top donor. But I think that's the job of the tool. And then with my other hat on and our other hat on, we do journalism where we do all of the things that you talk about on Sky News. So watch us on there and we'll highlight what we think is worth highlighting. And I wouldn't be an advocate of muddying the two.
I'm aware that we've run over time. In fact, in this whole project, we've run over time. Didn't we have some aspiration? I think weren't we launching early September? Oh, October first time. So it's taken longer than we thought. I hope that people stick around and have a drink and talk to each other, and in particular compare notes and understand the process. One of the things that's hard to describe is just how fascinating it is, to use John's phrase, when you get to peel away and understand how that works. And so, do please talk to, Joe and Katie, but Matthew and Tom and David and Sean, who's also been here on the receiving end of those complaints, and Nick. The teams here. I wanted to finish up by saying one thing, and I'm going to then give the final word to John. John said at the beginning, which Sky, you know, we also believe in partnerships. What you'll hear a lot from journalists these days is we believe in partnerships. Very, very few newsrooms ever actually partner anyone at all, right? And very few do so over a long period of time successfully, because it requires an incredible act of generosity and trust. You're talking about reputationally, you know, for each of us saying, no, we really respect and understand the way in which you bring your approach, your understanding, your contacts to bear. And I just wanted to say personally, for all of us at Tortoise, a relatively new and small newsroom, the fact that John Riley was willing to put his trust in us was an incredibly generous thing to do, and has meant a huge amount to all of us here. And not just the fact that you've come all the way in and made sure you're here for this ThinkIn, but to you and all of your colleagues at Sky, I just wanted to say that's been an incredibly important and generous thing, and it means a lot to all of us. So I want to say thank you to you, John. Yeah.
I just want to say a very big thanks to the people who actually really done the hard work. James and I have sort of sat above it and occasionally rather badly intervened and said, why isn't this thing ready? I mean, some of you are here, you've done a fantastic job and you've really dealt with some very difficult things, and will carry on dealing with difficult things as we sort of delve further into the numbers. As Sam says, this is only the beginning. Tell your friends about this. It is a fantastic tool, and as I said in the clip, it is there to help the voter understand better how our politics works.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming. Do stick around. It's an open newsroom. Let's see what we learn by just chatting from here. But for now, a very big thank you to Kat Neelan, to John Riley and Sam Coates. Thanks all of you.